um, uh, shout out to those of you I served on board with for Great River Region. I saw Gina Anthon on here earlier. I'm going to share the screen over in just a moment, but I wanted to say something about church boards. They're going to look different for different congregations for lots of reasons. Every congregation has its own traditions that are undoubtedly shaped to some extent by the people in the congregation. And we all have our different personalities and leadership styles. At the same time, there are some principles for board governance that I think are common. What I did with the Great River Region Board was to introduce them to a model of board governance called policy governance. It was created by a fellow named John Carver. As Nadine said, my day job is I'm the executive director of the United Way of Central Louisiana. We are a nonprofit organization. We fund a lot of other nonprofit organizations. We're kind of a human services department for Central Louisiana because no local unit of government has a human services department here. So it's kind of an interesting place to be. We ask, what do people need in our community? How do we do that? A board is important, not because it's the end goal. None of us go to church in order to attend board meetings. But a good functioning board helps the church do what it sets out to do. It's a means to an end. And I've seen a lot of congregations, and my guess is some of you have too, that seem all tangled up. Nobody quite understands what the right channels are to get things done. I was in a congregation once, and my Sunday school class was trying to get something done, and we kept hitting one roadblock after another, and our members voiced their frustration. And finally, an older member of the church, this happened when I was not one of the older members of the church, one of the older members of the church said, "You just need to go through channels." And my response was, that's my problem. I don't know what the channels are. As far as I can tell, there aren't any channels other than what one or two people who seem to be the only important voices in the church, what they think. Those seem to be the channels. And so board governance is one of those, almost a side issue in some ways, but what I've found in the nonprofit world is that if a board functions well and does its job, then other things tend to flow smoothly as well. And that's why I've tended to major on board governance in my career at United Way. Next month will be my 30th anniversary working with United Ways, first in Louisville, Kentucky, and the last 24 years here in Central Louisiana. I serve a board as executive director, and I have served on a lot of boards, a couple of dozen at least, and been chair of most of them. So I've seen boards function well, and I've seen some boards not function so well. So I think the difference is important. Nadine asked me to talk about the relevance of a board in a pandemic situation. And it's one example of why a board is important and how a good board can make a difference. And I should start with a word of confession. I think DC Sills was on the call earlier. I'm not seeing the whole list here. When I came to our church 10 years ago, we had 3 members, plus the piano player and me. And we didn't really need a board at that point, Now we have about 35 active members, and having a functioning board begins to become more important. Now, they don't meet regularly. It's not one of those boards that meets every third Thursday or whatever. They meet when they need to. And for our size congregation, that seems to work for us pretty well. The model I'm going to speak from is called policy governance. And it's going to look a little different with every organization, but I want to walk us through just to begin with, what's a board for? I'm going to go over here and share my screen. There we go. Everybody can see that. Are you all seeing that all right, Nadine?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks, Kristen.
Mm-hmm.
So the title I was assigned is How Church Boards Can Survive a Pandemic. And here we go. First question is, what's the role of a board? Oversight, power, prestige. Often we elect people to boards based on how prestigious they are or how powerful they may seem. Or maybe we elect somebody to a board to represent a group. Maybe they're just a nice person and everybody likes them. I've been part of a lot of board elections through my career, and I tend to tell people, when you elect people to a board, first give some thought as to what the job is of that board. And most people look at me blankly when I say that, because they've never thought about the question. Well, a board it's a board, and they don't really know. By the way, if my camera rattles, my dog is sitting in my lap here. So if you hear a bark, that's what's going on. Now, I'm going to share just a handful of principles out of the larger training that I did for the Great River Region Board years ago. And the first principle of all is that the board of a congregation represents the ownership. In a business board, the board represents the stockholders. In a nonprofit board, the board might represent the whole community, the interest of the whole community. It might represent the parents of disabled children. It just depends on the mission of that particular organization. But it's important to keep in mind, the board is not there to dominate the congregation. It's not there to tell the congregation what to do and keep it in line. The board is representing the interest of the whole congregation. That can get interesting, because the larger the congregation, the less likely it is that everybody will agree on what their interests are. So it can be a challenge to be on a board, and it's important. But it's important to remember, you're there as a holder of trust. In fact, some congregations call their board a trustee board. And the word trust is important there. They're holding the interest of the congregations in trust. And you can ask your members sometimes, it's a good conversation to have, to whom is our board responsible? And the answers I often get back include, well, we're responsible to God. We want to make sure that we honor what we're here for, the God that we serve. And of course, we're responsible to our members. We want to make sure that our members are getting what they need out of our congregation. And I would argue that a congregation is responsible to its larger community in some way. If a congregation does things that the community feels are harmful, then you've somehow violated a trust with that community. My seminary doctorate was in a field that they called church and community. So that's one that I feel fairly strong about. The board's main job can be summed up in the word governance. That's not a word you may hear very often, but in the last 30 years, it has really become a major focus of corporate matters, corporate boards. You may remember the Enron scandal years ago. That was all about a non-functioning board. GM years ago just a few years ago, had a problem with ignition switches, and people died as a result. Somebody looked into the board agendas for GM's board and found that they never talked about safety. They talked about profits, they talked about other things, but they never talked about safety until people started dying. And then the board began to pay some attention to safety. So first of all, governance is about providing a healthy link to your ownership. God, your members, the community at large. Do you understand as a board what all those people want from you? And then number two is really pivotal. You're defining or articulating the intended outcomes of a congregation. Stephen Covey made famous the saying, start with the end in mind. I've been part of planning groups in churches a long time ago, for example. We just started looking at data and sifting all kinds of stuff, and we wandered around about a year, and ended up with a great big 3-ring binder full of data and all kinds of stuff. Still had no idea what to do, but by George, we assembled a lot of data. A board's job, in part, is to articulate what it sees as what are the primary ends we have in mind? What are we here for as a congregation? What are we trying to accomplish? And does our congregation see it that way? Are we articulating a vision that our congregation buys into? And then third, to provide a broad structure of policy, channels, if you will. What are the channels to get things done in our congregation? Now, if your church has been around for a generation or 2 or 3 or more, you probably inherited a set of policies, a structure of policy, and that's great. When I do consultations with congregations, it's been a while since I've done one, but I used to do this fairly often. One of the things I ask is, where are your policies? Can I see a copy? And more often than not, I get kind of a panicked look like, well, you have to look back through our board minutes to see what our policies are. And what that sets up is a situation when an important question comes up in a conversation. Somebody will say, well, don't we have a policy about that? And then inevitably somebody else says, yeah, we voted on that. What was it, 5 years ago, 10 years ago, something like that. And I think we decided such and such. And somebody else says, well, I remember that a little differently. I thought we decided this and such. Well, you don't really have a policy if nobody knows what it is or where it is. It's not a functioning policy. So a board needs to make sure that whatever policies it's holding itself to are available. When somebody comes onto a board, they need to receive a set of your policies. Hopefully no longer than 15, maybe 20 pages, because beyond that, nobody's going to read all that and nobody's going to remember all that. And then finally, a board monitors the progress of the congregation toward whatever the ends are. What are we here to do? Are we doing it? Or are we just going through the motions and keeping the wheels spinning? What's going on? So that's setting up the goal, articulating the goal, monitoring progress toward the goal. That's what a board does. That's governance. Often, and just the point is, to wrap all that up, the board is ultimately responsible for congregational integrity. What are we here to do? Are we doing it? Are we of a piece, or are we split out in so many different ways? As I said, board governance has been the subject of attention in the corporate world for several decades now. Used to be, you got on the board because you were rich or because you were important, you were a major stakeholder, and you went to meetings when you could, and it just sort of rocked along like that. And then some fairly large companies got in some fairly large trouble, and people started paying more attention to the importance of governance. When I do training in board governance, I ask, are most boards well run? What do you think? And often what I get back is, some people feel good about their boards, and that's great. More often than not, I get, well, I'm not even sure what you mean by well run. It's unclear. I know of nonprofit organizations here in my community that went out of existence about 10 years ago. We just had this wave of nonprofit failures. And they were all different, but in every case, I could trace the problem back to a board that didn't really understand its job very well. And because nobody had ever trained, they were all good people. They all meant well. They all meant to do a good job, but no one had ever trained them in what it means to be a board. What is governance? What's my job? Traditionally, boards are run to focus on operational detail of the week or of the month. They get down into the weeds of who's going to bring the chocolate cake for the bake sale Saturday morning, or who's going to bring the green beans to the church supper, all that kind of operational detail. Now, don't get me wrong. Operational detail matters. It's really important. You can have the best policies in the world, but if you don't put them into practice, what good are they? So don't hear me saying that operations are not important. They are important. The purpose of policy, though, purpose of a board is the big picture. What are we here for? And are we accomplishing what we say we're here for? Allow your board to get bogged down in the weeds of operational details, and there are always more operational details than you can ever shake a stick at, then you're not doing your job of governance. Unfortunately, there are a whole lot of books out there on how to be a good board. From what I can tell, most of them aren't worth much. They tend to say, here's some good ideas, and they throw them out there at you. And they don't really focus on governance. You know, there's a board in Boston that did this and it worked well for them. There's a board in Texas that did this. Try that. It's just a collection of what somebody thinks are best practices. There's rarely an underlying model that you can follow consistently to be a strong board. In fact, the only model that I'm aware of is this policy governance model, and it was created by a guy named John Carver. His wife, Miriam, helps him do consultations and training and so forth. John created it. It's been around probably going on 50 years now. And it's not just for one kind of organization. When I went to my first training with them, most of the people there were from religious organizations. The one I happened to be at was mostly Lutheran, but different denominations have used this model. Congregations can use it, denominational boards can use it. There are global corporations that use this model. So the principles of board governance can be applied just about anywhere. Now, how you work them out is up to you and up to your congregation, but the basic principles are applicable just about anywhere. Boards have a specific job to do. One of the things John Carver said that was real pithy was, imagine a shortstop who just decides right field is a shade to your place. Right now, shortstop is in the sun, so I'm going to wander over to right field and be in the shade for a while. The shortstop's not doing his job when that happens. He's leaving a hole in the field. And boards don't do governance when they allow themselves to wander off into the weeds. They're not doing their job of governance. Now, in a small church particularly, you may have the same people doing the operations and the governance. That's perfectly fine. You know, somebody does need to figure out who's bringing the chocolate cake for the bake sale. But when you are a board, your job is governance. And we're going to talk about what that means. The second basic principle is determining the ends you have in mind. Like Dr. Covey said, what are we here for? What are we trying to accomplish as a congregation? Let's start there. Start with that end in mind. And what we mean by an end is a result for our consumer, to use Covey's term, or rather Carvey's term. You know, what changes are we trying to help people accomplish? Now, that in itself is a major insight for a lot of congregations, because sometimes we in the church feel like our job is to prevent change. Our job is to keep things the same as they've been, to preserve our heritage and not allow change to happen. Well, if that's the case, it's not surprising that people are abandoning our churches in droves these days. Church attendance reached a peak in 1955, the year of my birth, and it's been on a downhill slope ever since, and that has only picked up speed in the last several years. People need to go to church in order to grow, in order to learn, in order to expand who and what they are. That's change. Growth is change. Spiritual growth is change. Are we here to help people do that? Who are we trying to help do that? Is it members? Of course. Are we trying to create change in the local community? Maybe. And then third, which results do we value most? Are we going to focus our resources on youth? Are we going to focus our resources on young families? I've had churches have this conversation exactly before. We want to go after young families because they're the future of our church. Okay? We've all had family budgets where we wanted to do more than we had the resources to do, right? In our vacation, we want to take a vacation 1 month to Disney World, and we want to go to Europe the next month, and we want to, fly into outer space the month after that. Well, we may not have all the resources we need to do that. So we have to make some decisions about what matters the most, which results matter the most. Now, congregations can have those conversations. The board is the place where the focus tends to come together. So what are the changes we're trying to make? Who are we trying to help make them? And when it comes time where we have to make choices, what takes priority over something else? So the conversation becomes, what is our congregation trying to do? What's most important for our congregation? If I ask you, what's your congregation like? Maybe I'm the new kid in town and I'm trying to figure out, where do I want to go to church? And I ask you, tell me about your church. What's most important? I'm probably not going to give you more than a few seconds. We've all heard of the elevator speech, right? Where you only have enough time to ride on the elevator from one floor to another. And then people get off the elevator and you lose the chance to keep talking. Well, what is the defining feature of your church? How do people outside your church view your church? Are you sometimes, my church is described in the community as the liberal church in town, which is kind of interesting, but and then other people will say, what are you talking about? Disciples of Christ, who are they? Are they some kind of cult? We're the only disciples of Christ church people have ever heard of. So how do people describe your church? And then to get down to the subject at hand, how does the pandemic affect all of this? What's it got to do with our congregation and with our board? And of course, the primary issue around the pandemic is safety. How important is it that people feel safe at our church? And then we've all been weighing options, right? Do we keep meeting in person? We've all seen news stories about congregations where the pastor said, God will protect us. We're going to keep meeting. And then everybody in the church came down with the coronavirus. In some cases, the pastors have died because they got the coronavirus at church. Do we meet online? Do our people want to do that? Are they able to do that? Or maybe we have multiple services so we can spread people out. Maybe we do some hybrid of all of that. If we're going to meet at church, then we need to ask ourselves, is it safe? How do we make it safe? What are the dangers of meeting at church? And what does it say to our members and to the community if we get known as the church that spread the coronavirus? I wouldn't want to be that church, frankly. And then, so do we meet online? What are the dangers of doing that? When this all started, I think some of us were concerned that we would lose touch with our members would lose touch with us. And even more for ministers, are they going to quit giving? Are they going to quit tithing if they're not at church? And I know I have a friend who's a pastor of a church in town, a Baptist church, and he called me up in a panic one day, wondering if United Way could give his church money. And the answer was no, we don't have money for that. But his people since they weren't coming to church, they just quit sending in their tithe. And he was really struggling. I don't know how many churches have had that issue, but that's something to consider. So do we meet online? Are our people able to do so? The area I live in has a lot of rural areas where, frankly, internet connectivity is either non-existent or it's not very good. We have one couple that joins when they can, but more often than not, they just can't get onto the internet clearly enough to have a Zoom call where they are. Some members can't handle the technology. I have a 92-year-old father who lives up in the Nashville area. We got him an iPad so he could get on Facebook and keep up with the rest of us. He can't handle Facebook. He can't tap the icon on his iPad and just scroll through. He has like 5 friends on Facebook, but that's too much for him to handle. And of course, there are people who are ill, either with the coronavirus or whatever. It's not like we never got ill before the coronavirus. So those are all things your board needs to have a conversation about. And then if we don't meet, then when is it safe to return? What will be the signal that it's okay to start coming back? My church's last worship service, I believe, was March 15th, and our first time back was this past Sunday. Our governor declared we were in phase 3 because the numbers were getting better. That meant restaurants began to open up. Life began to come a little bit back to normal, and people were getting out anyway. And so it kind of seems silly not to do something to keep up with the rest of the community. So some of our members began coming back in person. Some don't feel comfortable with that yet. We just bought a hotspot so we can continue to broadcast our services. In fact, some members actually prefer that. Do we offer a hybrid like that? Or are we going to do all one or the other? How do we know? What will be the signal when it's time to come back? How do we communicate that decision to all of our members and to the community at large? Who's going to do what? And then how do we keep the routine functions of the church going? How do we keep our bills paid if we're not going to be at the church office? If there's a storm, like 2 hurricanes within 6 months here, who's going to go by and check the church building to make sure it's okay? And if there's damage, who's going to take care of that? All those kinds of questions come up in a pandemic because the routine of the church just gets changed. Now, one of the principles I really like about John Carver's policy governance model is this one right here. The best way the board can provide oversight for the congregation is to define boundaries, to limit, not to give permission or prescribe. And the reason that the 10 Commandments they're a symbol of the 10 Commandments is exactly this principle. When you think about the 10 Commandments, I've asked many groups this, no one's ever been able to answer it correctly. How many of the 10 Commandments are worded positively? The answer is 2. Honor your father and mother, honor the Sabbath. Just about everything else is a thou shalt not. Now, if you're like me and you grew up in the 60s with the flower children and so forth, it seems really negative, man, you're harshing my buzz. I don't want to have all these negative rules. Well, actually, the way this works out is it gives you more freedom, because the example of the 10 Commandments, you've got a mission: honor your parents, keep the Sabbath, and everything else defines boundaries. But within those boundaries, go for it. Knock yourself out. Try different methods. Do different things. Just don't violate the boundaries. Don't do anything immoral or unethical or things that violate the law. But within those boundaries, you are free. I have a friend who was once the executive director of a pretty large nonprofit. That board of that nonprofit basically didn't allow her to do anything unless they had approved it first. Well, you can imagine how frustrating that is, but a lot of boards are that way. She was terrified to take initiative or try anything that the board had not first said was okay. So when it came to, does this come to the board? The answer was, well, is it important? If it's important, it goes to the board, which meant she had no power at all to execute initiative because the board didn't trust her. The board had never said, here are your boundaries, here's your mission. The board was saying, in effect, keep the wheel spinning, we'll let you know when we want you to do something. That is not a healthy model. It is not a model for growth, for risk, for pushing the envelope and trying new things that can help you grow. Excuse me just a minute. So, examples of that. Well, we're not going to do anything that will endanger the health of anybody who worships with us. That's our boundary. If there's something that endangers people's health, we're not going to go there. That means now the board's job is to spell that out. The policy is we don't do anything unsafe. That means we're all going to wear masks. That means we'll have hand sanitizer available throughout the church facility. That means we're going to talk about congregational singing. it's not particularly safe, because when you sing, you're projecting all those droplets from your lungs out further into the air, which spreads a greater risk of the virus. So how are you going to handle that? Some congregations have simply said, we're not going to have any singing. What ours did last Sunday as an experiment was we kept our mask on and just very softly sung the words without projecting our voices. I think most of us hummed or maybe just spoke the words softly, but that was how we chose to do that. Physical distance. I think most churches have roped off every other pew or every third pew, or whatever. There was a rabbi once, not long ago, who said, social distancing is the wrong term. It's really physical distancing. Especially now, we need to come together socially through technology, even if we're keeping our distance physically. And I think that's a really good insight for us in the church. We need to articulate our commitment to safety. Sometimes I forget, I just assume people know all the things that I'm going to tell them. But that's why we come back to church every Sunday, because we forget. We have to keep reminding and recommitting ourselves. We have to articulate, we have to say, guys, we're doing all this because we are committed to everyone's safety. We're not going to do anything that is unsafe or that will spread the virus. Another basic principle is a board is responsible to forge a linkage with the membership that is both empowering and safe. My friend at the nonprofit did not have an empowered relationship with her board. She was not allowed to do much of anything except just keep the routine going. A board needs to provide an atmosphere, a structure where people in the congregation feel they are free to carry out their personal callings, whatever that might be, within the certain boundaries. So no, you can't go out and incur debt on behalf of the congregation without a congregational vote. That's a boundary. I know of one nonprofit where the executive director went out and took out a big loan without the board's knowledge or approval, and it sank the agency. Long story there, but that board had never said you can't do that. So he did it. And it needs to be safe. The members need to know that as long as I observe these boundaries, I'm safe. Nobody's going to tell me that I've done something terrible. Or if they do, then the conversation that follows is this: did it further our goals? Well, yeah. Say a Sunday school class goes out and feeds the homeless one day, and somebody objects. We've all had experience where somebody objected to something we thought was perfectly fine. Well, did what they do further the church's mission? Well, I guess so. Did it violate any of our policies? Did they do anything illegal or immoral or unethical? Well, no. I just think they should have done it a different way. That's irrelevant. You can feed the homeless your way if you want to, but they didn't violate any policies, and they furthered the mission. So if somebody objects, that's just a personal opinion. It is not a reason to call the board together in crisis. So that's the importance of the linkage between the board and the membership of the congregation. And then monitoring. It's well and good to set up the policies. The question is, are we observing? Are we accomplishing the goals we set out? Are we reaching the ends we have in mind? And in this case, with the pandemic, the question is, are our people getting sick? If we're meeting and they're getting sick as a result, then we're not making good progress toward our goal. Or are people observing precautions at home or at work? Are we in emphasizing the importance of safety here? Now, then the question becomes, as events change, the numbers go up or go down, and the community around us, do we continue what we're doing right now, or do we need to change something? Do we need to, if the numbers in our community are going up, do we need to pull back and not meet in person for a while? But if they're going down, do we need to come back and meet in person, although we've been meeting online for a while? The monitoring is important? Are people being safe? Do we need to change the way we're worshiping and teaching as a result? Um, what's the signal for us for coming back together or for going back online? Can we figure that out ahead of time, or do we just want to play it by ear? And either one is fine as long as your board understands this is what we've chosen. And then board self-evaluation. This is something most boards probably don't do. Every meeting, at the end of the meeting, it helps for just to take a moment or two to say, hey, everybody, how was this meeting for you? Did we do what we said we wanted to do? Or did we chase rabbits? Did we wander off into some unrelated field? Well, we probably chased rabbits more than we should have. This meeting maybe could have been a little shorter because we wandered off a bit. A board chair's job, whoever that chair is and whatever the title is to keep the meeting on track. I think we've all been in meetings where the board just sat there like a bump on a log and allowed the conversation to go wherever. The board's key job is to keep the meeting on track and say, you know, Fred, that's an interesting point you're raising, but that is really beside the point of what we're here to talk about tonight. Maybe we can talk about that next time or offline somewhere. You and I talk about that. But for right now, let's get back to the question at hand. You can do it nicely. Sometimes you're forced to do it a little more abruptly, but that's a chair's job. And the frequency of self-evaluation is important. Don't do like a lot of us used to do and have a study every 5 or 10 years to see how we're doing, because that tends to get put up on a shelf after a lot of time and effort have gone into it. Just every meeting, have an informal conversation, maybe even after the meeting. How do we do? How are you feeling about our meetings? Are you looking forward to our meetings? Are we talking about important things? When our United Way board started using this model, we went from talking about minute financial issues that no one really cared about, maybe 1 or 2 people did, to why is it in our community that 4-year-olds are already behind when they enter pre-K? What can we do as a community about that? People look forward to those meetings. I've had people tell me before meetings started, I've got to leave early. I got to get back to the office. And the conversation was so interesting, they stayed half an hour late. Even after the meeting ended, they stuck around chatting, and they blew off their meeting at work because this was an important conversation to them. Do our board meetings at church live up to that standard? If not, why not? If we're not talking about things that matter, why are we talking? What are the things that matter in our congregation? What are we doing about those things? That's the kind of self-evaluation that a board needs to do from time to time. Now, recommended reading, Carver has written a whole lot of stuff. The one I recommend is highlighted, well, sort of highlighted in brown there. It's Corporate Boards That Create Value. And to be honest, the reason I recommend that one is the shortest book of all of them. It's a couple hundred pages, but it's also fairly straightforward. And it's written for corporate boards, but the principles apply to congregational boards as well, for the most part. And he's written more than most people I know, most authors I know. Somebody accused him of never having had an unpublished thought. And that's fine. But I did a version of this, an expanded version of this, for our Great River Region board years ago when Nadine first came. And I think we found it helpful. Certainly my United Way board has found it helpful. Keep us on track with what matters. Why are we getting together every month or every quarter or however often your board meets? Nadine made a note. Oh, thanks for the happy anniversary there, Nadine. And this issue of whether we come back to in-person worship or not. in my congregation, it was just an ongoing conversation. You know, we had one or two people who were really itching to get back in person, but nobody, you know, got all bent out of shape about it. But I'm sure there are congregations that have gotten very bent out of shape, and they bent the pastor out of shape as a result, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And if you have a structured board conversation where everybody votes, even if you don't all see it quite the same way, it's no longer the pastor's fault. It's the board set some clear boundaries. The board set some clear expectations. This is why we're going to come back together or not come back together, and communicate that to the congregation. So we're not all looking at the most obvious person, the pastor, and blaming that person for whatever it is we don't like. That's a sure sign of poor governance in a congregation.
Mm-hmm.
The board, the lay leadership, needs to take responsibility. I don't care what your denomination is. You're not there just to meet for the sake of meeting. You're there to provide leadership, servant leadership, to be sure, but
Mm-hmm.
nonetheless.
Good.
Um, I'm going to pull it up there, Nadine, and see if people have questions
Mm-hmm.
or outraged objections.
Any questions, comments?
Oh, cool. Jay Hoyt was born in this area at England Air Park was England Air Force Base. Um, very nice. Well,
Mm-hmm.
I may know some of your relatives here, Jay. I have a good friend named Carolyn Hoyt.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
This is good.
yeah, board governance is not one of those things that gets people all fired up as a general rule, but bad governance and people get fired up in a hurry.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. All right.
Well, Nadine, I hope that met y'all's expectations. And if people are interested, we can do the more full version of the training for board governance. I really do think this policy governance model is very helpful,
Mm-hmm.
and we've just covered part of it today, but hopefully enough to be helpful.
Like you had said earlier, Dave, for smaller congregations who don't have a board, what advice and counsel can you give them as far as following some of the principles that you outlined?
I think just have clear expectations, and if you can do that with your whole congregation, great. You know, you may not need a board because the board's job is to be a focus point for the whole congregation. And if your congregation is small enough that you're a board of the whole, then that's great. But
Mm-hmm.
important to clarify and articulate, what are we here for? What
Mm-hmm.
each person expecting from the experience with that congregation?
Mm-hmm.
You know, and there can be different priorities. Some people are just really focused on evangelism, others on contemplative prayer, etc. Some people are there, you know, we have one church member who really doesn't care that much about religious stuff, as he says. But boy, anytime the building needs a repair, he is on the spot, you know,
Mm-hmm.
donated ladders and all kinds of stuff, drop of a hat. That's his ministry, you know. Um, So I think for a small congregation, just making sure that your expectations are clear and that everybody understands this is our system. At some point, we may need to set up a board of maybe 2 or 3 people, so that everybody's not having to go through all these questions all the time.
Mm-hmm.
You know, what would that point look like? If you have a newcomer who has, well, let me tell you a real story from our church. We had a newcomer who had some very strong opinions about what our church should be doing. and we weren't doing most of them. And he started slinging around some pretty accusatory language and so forth. And our board said, had a different idea in mind. Well, he said, well, who is this board? I need to talk with them. And he wasn't going to be satisfied no matter what. But the rest of the congregation understood, yeah, we have a structure. Yeah, we have a board. And yes, there's a way that we do things. We don't just haul off and do something because somebody gets ugly about it. So just, again, being clear in your expectations, clear in your goals.
Yeah.
How big or small you are, you can do that.
Somebody asked a question, Carola, please clarify the line of demarcation of board versus elders roles.
That's good.
Yeah, and Nadine, you may be better qualified to answer that than me. We have deacons and we have board members in our congregation. I suspect that definition may vary from congregation to congregation.
Yeah, it does, particularly when you talk about elders, who is more of an under shepherd to the pastor, with spiritual responsibilities for the congregation, as opposed to that board or body that's responsible for the administrative, and bringing those two together. So but depending on the size and the culture of your congregation, you may have elders who run the church, who sit in that board position and make decisions on behalf of the congregation. So I think it's different from congregation to congregation.
Yeah, and in an Episcopal denomination, they have a vestry that functions as the board. We call different things in different settings. And my understanding of Disciples of Christ is that, there's enough diversity within our denomination that terms will get used in different ways. And that's fine, because that congregation understands what is meant there.
But then if you don't have checks and balances, then you can get a runaway train.
That's right.
Situation too, with folk who do not have the best interests of the church at heart.
Which is why the boundaries become important. I think Nadine has had to deal with some congregations where somebody hauled off and did something. Congregation said, wait a minute, what are you talking about? You should have known better than to do that. Well, and arguably the person should have, but was allowed to do it and was given the boundaries to prevent it from.
One of the things that we have at Cross Street, and hello everybody, one of the things that we have at Cross Street is that our board is comprised of basically all of the elders that were there. Now we've run into a situation now where the former head of our board was an elder, and he's passed on, and several of our elders have passed on. But the elders and the deacons, members of the diaconate, all meet on the board, and most of the time, especially in recent years, everybody has basically been on one accord. The problem occurs, as you mentioned earlier, is when you get one person in there or two people in there that don't want to do things that are good for the church. And one of the things that I always think about is that 1 Corinthians 14:40, let all things be done decently and in order. And so I just tell my students that in school. Matter of fact, I had that at the bottom of their list of our rules. And I put the 1 Corinthians 14:40 on there. So I don't know if I was violating anything between schools and church, but it was at the bottom, that all things be done decently and in order. And I said, well, if it's not decent, don't do it. That's a wide range of things. If it's not in order, don't do it. It's just those two items. And so I always question it, was what you did decent? Well, I don't think it was. Was what you did in order? No, I interrupted somebody, and we go by that. So at this particular point, with the pandemic having such a heavy weight on our congregations, we've been meeting since July. We went back to meet in July, and we do all those things that, like what I just said, are decent and in order. We don't encourage people that have special conditions to come. We take temperatures. We are separate because our congregation is small enough, and those that are coming now, the numbers are small enough so that we are kept at a good physical distance. And I agree with you. I never have liked the social distance because it's physical distance. And what we do is we try to socially stay in contact with each other. Matter of fact, last Sunday we were finished preaching, and there were, I don't know, about a half a dozen or so folks that came down front, and they were all sitting around, and one of our elders at that time said, "Look at us, church is over with, and we still sitting around here talking. We must miss each other." Yeah, you the one. Okay. And we're sitting around talking to each other. We must miss each other. And so we do those things, but we have to remember that it's the cause of Christ we're looking at. And if everybody's on the same page, then we're going to be successful. We're not going to have any problems. We'll get through this pandemic. We'll be, it's not going to take what some people thought. They thought, like some people thought it was going to be over with it when summer came. But anybody that looks at the history of the Spanish flu, and I'm going to stop because I'm going to start preaching on that in a minute. But anybody has done their homework, their history homework, they know that the Spanish flu, it took them 2 years. It took them 2 years. And so, I know we got some more technology and things of that nature, but if you're just going to look at a system as to what's going to happen, then you look toward the past and see what happened in the past, and that doesn't mean everything is going to happen just like it did, but at least you have some type of a boundary, some type of idea. And I'm going to stop talking about. I want to say this about David. Britt. David was our moderator. He had to serve another moderator's term practically because that moderator left us, but wasn't able to continue their term. And what I learned about being a moderator, I learned from David Britt. And the thing that stands that stands out in my mind is that he said that the moderator is supposed to be sure that the board does its job. And we read those things every meeting that we have. We read, we evaluate what we have done. Now there's a lot of them, so we can't go through all of them at one time. But through the course of the year, we always go through those items that where the board looks at and say, well, did we do this? Did Dr. Nadine Burton do what she was supposed to do? And of course, the answer to that was always yes. But we evaluate, and I got that being moderator elect from David Britt.
Amen. Good.
Thank you, Brother Palmer. Gina had asked, what comes first, improved governance or a clear new mission and vision? And I think the process of discussing the possibilities and articulating a new mission and vision, that is part of good governance. And it starts there. That, you start with the end in mind. Well, what are the ends? Well, that's the discussion of what's our mission? What do we want to see happen here? That's the first part of good governance. So if you're doing that, you're engaging in good governance. You're not finished, but that's how you start.
Awesome. All right, that has taken us up to our time. Any other last minute questions, comments for Dave?
May I?
Barbara?
I'm Barbara Smith from Cross Street Christian Church. Reverend Palmer is our minister, guide, leader. He's all things to Cross Street. But just as he said, the moderator ensures that the board does its job. Is the chairman of the board of the church that person? Does the chairman of the board ensure that the board will do its job?
I would say yes. And our regional board, the chair is referred to as the moderator, but it's a changeable term.
Right.
Sometimes the board chair is called a president. I had a little confusing because sometimes the chief executive is also called the president. So I tend to reserve the term president for the chief executive for the leader of the board. To me, that's a little clearer, a little less ambiguous, I guess, than the chair or moderator, either one.
Thank you.
Awesome, awesome. Anything else? Thank you so much, Dave, for being with us. A good refresher course for me, but just in the midst of the pandemic, it's good to hear what we're supposed to be doing as boards. And so thank you for your wisdom and your insight. And let me just say, y'all, Dave is going to be leaving us. I hope I'm not being premature, but
That's fine.
He'll be leaving the Great River region the end of the year. He's relocating, retiring to Baltimore, Maryland. And so just want you to know how much we will miss you being in the Great River, but we know God has so much more in store for you as you and Miss Viola go to take Baltimore by storm. And so,
Well, Nadine.
right. Well, not by storm. We don't like that term.
Yeah, we've had too many storms here.
Right, we don't like that. But we wish you Godspeed and blessings on your future retirement.
Thank you. And I'm very grateful, Nadine, for you and your friendship and leadership, and Gina and Rita and Robert, and all those who were served on the board with me. And I got a chance to know, and the rest of you, I guess none of us will ever meet all of the disciples members out there in our region, but I have learned a great deal from all of you. Thank you so much for the experience.
Thank you. Thank you. Awesome. Awesome. And I'll be in contact with you, Dave. Why don't we take a break and we'll get ready for our